tonic, pretonic, propretonic. Propretonic comments are reduced to schwa. Right? Then what would happen? You get rule of schwa, and that would become a heuric. But none of that happens. This form is completely dishonest, if you will. We don't get any vowel reduction. Now, there's a theory, and for what it's worth, there's a theory that says that this accent here on the end of the word is completely bogus. They didn't pronounce it that way. It's simply a way that the Masoretes use to indicate there's something about this form they want you to look at and pay attention to. Sort of like they put a metheg next to the comments, when there's some doubt about that, just as a sign to you. Well, there is a theory, and no one can prove it one way or the other. Don't have any ancient Masoretes around to ask. But there is a theory which says that this is completely bogus, that it's not a real, it's obviously not a real accent because the accent doesn't really shift because none of the other things which ought to happen do happen. So the answer to your question is, can you tell if this is a Waw consecutive perfect or a perfect with a conjunction? The answer is sometimes you can, because we cannot be absolutely certain that forms without the accent here are forms with a conjunction, because it's not the usage isn't consistent. But there are some forms where the accent is here, and when the accent is here, when you see this anomalous accent here, that's a sign that says I'm a Waw consecutive. Okay. You can't prove the other way. You can't reverse it and say when the accent's there, it's definitely not, because there are some examples of forms that must be Waw consecutive perfects from the context, but in fact are not so marked. So either the Masoretes were just inconsistent. Keep in mind, these guys worked over a period of 500 years. It wasn't the same guy doing all of this. It developed in different places over different times. Different books were done by different people, different groups at different times. So they were not entirely consistent in their usage of these things. But where it occurs, this is a clear sign that this is a Waw consecutive form. So there will be some that what happens with when you negate these forms is that you break the sequence and start a new sequence over again. So if you've got, let's say we've got katal, y, yik, to, okay. So far we're all right here. And now we want to say something didn't happen, okay? So we go along a little more, and now we get walo, katal. Okay. So now the once you insert this, you've broken the sequence. So if you want to express the past tense idea, you go back to the perfect. And once you've done that, now you can go back to wayiktal again. Wayiktal again. So whenever you insert a lo, you break the chain, you break the narrative chain, and you have to start over again. Start the chain over again. So and the same is true if you're working the other way around. If this were an imperfect, this were a Waw consecutive perfect, lo would force you to start, would force you to put another imperfect before you start the chain over again. So just think of it as lo breaks the narrative sequence. Just sort of like chopping the chain in half, and you have to start a new chain.
So when you use a lo, in either perfect or imperfect, you don't have Waw consecutive form.
That's correct.
You've got, and not, you
yeah.
That next form as true.
Yeah, that's right. You will never have a Waw consecutive form following a lo like this. That's correct. Because by definition, it's no longer consecutive, if you will. You've broken this narrative sequence by changing the idea. By inverting it. So once you break the chain with anything, not just lo, but anything that breaks this sequence, lo is very commonly, it's probably the most common thing that does it. But anything that forces you to break the sequence, forces you to start the chain over again. And the actual usage here is pretty flexible. Sometimes, for no reason that's apparent to us, they'll just start a new sequence, perhaps with a change of subject or a change of paragraph. There are no paragraph divisions in the original text, of course, but sometimes sometimes that's a clue that there's a break here, a change of meaning, you know, a change in paragraph. And in many cases, in terms of translating to English, you note the chain, you note the break in the chain, and say, all right, I either start a new sentence or I start a new paragraph, because obviously there's a conceptual change here. It often happens with subject changes as well, although not always. But as we saw this morning, you can change the subject without breaking the chain, but sometimes the chain does break with a change of subjects, and that's probably when you start a new paragraph in English. Sort of like a new idea is beginning here. As long as the old idea is continuing, the chain continues unless it's broken. Here first and then there. Yeah.
Is this true for both the imperfect waw consecutive as well as the perfect?
You mean the low?
Right.
Yes. Yeah. There's a kind of a common syntax for these things, even though historically they're completely different. As it's developed in usage, by the time we have the biblical text, there's a common sequence that's developed, and scholars debate about this. Why is it the way it is? Many people think the waw consecutive perfect is just mimicking the behavior of the imperfect, but that's a matter for a graduate course in Hebrew philology, not for beginning Hebrew. Okay, yes.
Without using the low, how would you break the sequence and still use the conjunction and with the verb without it being mistaken for something that's still in the sequence?
Well,
in other words, you want to change tense,
right,
and use a legitimate and without being collected into the sequence.
Well, okay. So this becomes this is perfect for all intents and purposes. In translating, you're going to translate this as if it's perfect, right? I mean, it's not really, it's preterite, but for translating purposes, it's going to come out sounding perfect in English. And now we want to change to an imperfect. That's your question, right? So what do you do? So we want an imperfect, and we want and on it. So now we just stick the conjunction on the front of the imperfect. So our imperfect form is yiktol, and how do we point the conjunction? Yeah, just with a schwa. So see now, this is a change of tense. This is just an imperfect with a conjunction, and it changes. It means sort of the narrative continues. This is the next thing in the narrative, but the tense has changed because it's not waw consecutive. And by the way, as Professor Bartelt mentioned this morning, when we introduce waw, we tell students that it means and. In fact, it's a much more general purpose kind of connector. It can mean but. It can mean then, like the next thing in the sequence, like he killed and then he will do then he did something else. You could translate it next in some cases. It's a much more general purpose kind of connector than we tell people at the beginning. It's because it's too much to load onto people at one time. But it's actually much more flexible. And of course, the most common thing you do with them is just leave them out after a while. Except King James, every other sentence in the Old Testament begins with the word "and" in the King James Bible. If you haven't noticed, Hebrew is a very coordinating language. The Hebrew does have some subordinate clauses. We haven't talked about them yet. We do have some. But Hebrew is primarily a coordinating language, not a subordinating language. English, like Greek and Latin, are subordinating languages. In other words, we like subordinate clauses. Hebrew has them, but it just has many fewer different types of them. It's much more common to just connect things with an and go on with life.
If you want to